You know, as much as I like digital purchases of games, it's kind of a shame that I can't flex my library of video games to outsiders. What if someone enters my room and they'll think that I only have like 3 PS4 games? It's kind of a shame. But anyway, I recently made a Yakuza character 3x3, and since I have opinions, I might as well share them because why the hell not? So at the bottom we have my boy Date-san. Now there are several candidates I had in mind for number 9, and as for why I picked him over the rest, it's for a very simple and not so complicated reason. He's a very familiar face. He's been around since the first game, a guy who from the very beginning was skeptical towards the murder of the Dojima family patriarch back in '95. The guy had Kiryu's back all throughout the story. At the same time, Kiryu himself helped Date and his daughter out, which ended up improving their father-daughter relationship, which was rocky at the time. And unlike the Floors, who's also a familiar face that I like and has formed a friendly, reliable relationship with Kiryu, what makes Date stand above him is how flexible he is. Depending on the game, he might be in a completely different position. He could be a cop, he could be an ex-cop with connections, a bartender, a journalist, and then a cop again after his contributions and skills were recognized. And no matter what, he's always doing something to help. Even as a bartender, it allowed for Kiryu to return to his main hideout when Mama was on a break. When you spend such a long time with such a cool guy who really nails his role of a supporting character quite literally, you end up getting a huge soft spot for him, and I can't help but placing him in my 3x3. Also, now that I think about it, I think he's the only character on my list who isn't a Yakuza, which is pretty interesting. Next, we have the one and only Ryuji. Now, in the world of the Yakuza games, I'd like to think that there's this spectrum where on one extreme side, we have the logical business-driven men who, while strong, are very calculative and operate under financial and political power. Meanwhile, on the other side of the spectrum, we have the more emotional men, driven by physical power, and may have slightly irrational but still consistent, bombastic, and on some level respectable convictions. Ryuji, of course, falls more on the latter side of the spectrum, and there are other characters who act similarly, but with Ryuji, what makes him stand out is, for one, the specifics of his convictions. I really like his philosophy that there should only be one dragon, which is why he gets angry whenever someone calls him the Dragon of Kansai, because the Kansai part shouldn't even be part of his title, as if there should be a need to make a distinction in order to separate from others, when to him there should only be one dragon. It's also the reason why he's obsessed with Kiryu, because he's known as the Dragon of Dojima, which creates this interesting rivalry between them, which also extends beyond just the titles. Ryuji is a part of the Omi Alliance, which is the Tojo clan's biggest rival, and although Kiryu claims that he's not a part of the clan anymore, no matter how you want to see it, he's still involved in it, even ignoring the fact that he was at one point declared the 4th chairman not so long before he dropped the position. If the Omi Alliance starts shit with the Tojo clan and Kamurocho, you know damn well Kiryu will stand up, especially when he's one of the main targets. Also, I like how both of them have Ryu in their names. I think that's pretty clever. The second thing that makes him stand out is his backstory. You see, Ryuji has family ties with the Jingwen Mafia, a group that was massacred many years ago by members of the Tojo clan, and he's one of the few survivors of that said event. With that, you'd think that after learning this, he would feel some amount of kinship and urge to take revenge for the prejudice that he and his family face, but he doesn't care. It also seemed like he still remembers that tragic night, but never really took much thought into it, didn't even consider who his mother was. All he wanted was to take steps into overtaking Jin and becoming the most powerful Yakuza there. And this commitment he has is so perfectly illustrated in his last fight against Kiryu. After he saw Jin, a somewhat of a father figure to him, getting shot by Takashima and declaring that he only wanted to take advantage of his connection with the Jingwen Mafia to spread nationwide and rule the entire country, after Terada activated a bomb that would explode in the location they were, you would think that he would put away his conviction to process what was going on and even on some level get some kind of strong emotional release. But despite some tendency, the guy still stayed true to his conviction, so much so that he wanted to continue his fight against Kiryu that was interrupted, even though there's a time bomb that will explode anytime soon, but he doesn't give a fuck. It's not even because he doesn't care about what he's being told, it's just that he's so committed to his battle for the title of Dragon, and of course, Kiryu doesn't back down from the fight. It's just such a badass moment. I consider it to be one of the biggest highlights of the series. But even after all of that, in his last moments, he showed some affection for his sister. So despite being so consumed by his quest for power, he still has it in him to be loving. Rest in peace, you passionate soul. Next, we have Somaya, another great individual who died a noble death. Now, since the beginning, I've had my eyes on this guy. When I first spotted him, my first impression was that he felt like a new type postmodern Yakuza. Unlike many who continue to practice a lot of the same traditions, Somaya is someone who's willing to reject habits from the past if he sees no value left to them, and feels no obligation to show respect for them in the process. Even something as basic as getting a back tattoo, he doesn't do that because he sees it as meaningless. He's someone who's willing to observe the circumstances, hence why he recognizes that some members can be valuable for their prowess in paperwork, and can see why the clan being financially motivated can draw in intelligent people. But when the situation is different, as in what we saw with the invasion of the Chinese enemies in Yakuza 6, he saw a need for fight-oriented Yakuza being put up front. I found interest in this attitude given Kiryu's old age and how their generation gap would play out in the game. In the end, he never ended up being the main villain in spite of the strong antagonistic vibes he emitted that felt throughout the game. Instead, he had a more unstable relationship with Kiryu where their goals and ideals never fully aligned, which led to a lot of tension between them, but we would occasionally see them partner up whenever Somaya saw value in having Kiryu, even if eventually that partnership would go south when they had clashing goals. The icing on the cake, though, was in his last moments. His ex-wife got kidnapped and he got blackmailed into fighting Kiryu. Later on, Tsuneo said to Kiryu that if he didn't kill Somaya, Kiryu would get shot. Now keep in mind, by that point, we knew that Somaya was a shitty abusive husband and drove Kiryu to abandon him and her daughter. He was the reason for a lot of the grief she had to go through. And yet, here you have the same shitty guy allowing himself to be a puppet, all for the sake of Kiryu. So much so that when he realized Kiryu wasn't going to kill him, he showed no hesitance in his last second to just stab himself instead. And as if that wasn't enough, he entrusted Nagumo to take care of his daughter because he recognized the fact that Nagumo loved Kiryu, and although he may have shattered his relationship with her, he never once laid a hand on his daughter, and he died never resorting to being her, and did what he could to make sure she was in good hands. Now look, we can all agree that Somaya is certainly not the best person ever, but no matter what, he died a man, and I can at least respect that. Now what I'm about to do next is a little bit unusual for a countdown list video. I mean, it's probably better if you don't think of it that way. I'm going to simultaneously talk about number 6 and number 2. And the reason for that is, it's kind of impossible to talk about Awano without also referencing what's appealing about Kuze. So just in case anyone gets confused, I do like Kuze more than Awano, they're not equally ranked. Anyway, a lot of my appreciation for these two characters essentially boils down to their role in Yakuza 0. Something about the game that's almost distinct from the rest of the series is the sense of powerlessness and insecurity. Over time, Kiryu eventually came to build a strong reputation and legendary status in Kamurocho and even in other cities, so much so that even people that are in powerful political and financial positions have some amount of respect for him, which gives me as a player a feeling of confidence and empowerment when facing against whatever conflict the game has to offer. But in Yakuza 0, this is much different, especially if this is your debut game, because you know practically nothing about this world and you don't know what kind of person Kiryu will become. You just see a man doing the task he was ordered to fulfill by his superiors, then suddenly he gets mixed up in some kind of trouble, and once that happens he receives an overwhelming amount of pressure and threat by his superiors. And sure, in every game Kiryu always gets hunted down and cornered by his enemies, but in this game he's just a nothing character. He has no legendary status, and it wasn't long ago before he was considered nothing more than your average Yakuza working for the Dojima family. So I don't think any other entry in the series perfectly emulates the feeling of getting bullied. And sure, Awano and Kuze were not the only higher ups in the Dojima clan, but I would argue they were the most interesting. They certainly had the most striking character designs, their outfits are super memorable, and their faces really gave off this classic shady gangster look, much more intimidating than when you compare to, let's say, Kiryu and Nishiki when we were first introduced to them in the game. And then later, Kiryu was summoned by his superiors after he had supposedly fucked up for killing someone in the empty lot, and once he enters, their aesthetic alone brings up this strong and unsettling aura, as if any tiny slip up will get your arm chopped or something. Aside from their designs, even their attitudes I feel like surpassed someone like Shibusawa. I think that it was a lot more entertaining to listen to them act like tough bosses. Then there's also their characterization, of course. What I like about Awano in particular is similar to why I like Somaya, as in he represents a generational disconnect with the past values and is willing to disregard the true Yakuza ethics due to the fact that he's not just money hungry, he is pleasure hungry.
Kiryu. 俺はクゼとは違う。極道としての生き方なんざどうでもいいと思ったら、いい飯食っていいもん身につけていい車でぶっ飛ばす。たまには女もつまみ食いしながらな。俺にとっちゃ極道なんて職業はそういった人生を楽しむための手段に過ぎねえ。
While he may have started off being a simple bloodthirsty Yakuza eager to fight in his earlier days, as he grew old he came to value the luxuries that came from living this lifestyle. In a way, he's a more depraved version of the logical business-driven Yakuza, given his bigger tendency to openly lust for pleasures of the rich lifestyle. He also has a really cool fight against Majima in which both of them had contrasting philosophies. While Awano strives for the safe for living conditions, Majima on the other hand scoffs at that idea, and while this would be better illustrated by the way he acts later down the line, he had a much more respect for people who put themselves out there and live a more free-spirited life, and I'd like to think that this experience served to further solidify his values and what he would eventually become in the future. Kuze on the other hand, despite sharing the same goals as Awano, the way he thinks is very different. In fact, there's nothing he would want more than to risk his life if it meant standing up for his pride. He's definitely a lot more of a fist-oriented dude, and for the sake of defending his physical status, he will go through lengths in order to defeat the one person posing a challenge to him, seen in his last fight against Kiryu where he chose to forbid anyone from helping him in their confrontation. His relationship with Kiryu in the game is, for me personally, one of the biggest highlights. Here you have a man who declares that to decide who's the strongest Yakuza isn't about who wins in a battle, it's about who stands on top in the long run. So no matter how many times you get put down, you can always come back stronger as long as you have the right determination, which is how Kuze was approaching his feud with Kiryu throughout the game. But by the end, in the last fight, he could no longer stand up and had to recognize that 1. Kiryu was getting stronger as they continued to trade fists with each other, and 2. There was no way he could physically catch up with him in time, and his willingness to recognize that and respect Kiryu enough to give him important details on their plans is why I find their relationship to be so special. It's very clear Kiryu respects him, so much so that he continuously call him Kuze Anike. I'm sure he has some amount of influence for him, given how they're both physical tanks who strive to never give up. Also, what a coincidence that they wear similarly colored suits. Now, I guess if I had to give an explanation for why I like Kuze more than Awano, well, I just think he's more entertaining overall, and he's much more of a ludicrous concept for a character, being this guy who won't stop coming after Kiryu no matter how many times he gets pummeled, and the fact that they tie that into his philosophy makes me appreciate the way he's written a lot more. You know, at this point, I expect that every new Yakuza game will try to introduce a new villain or threat, but I remember when I played Kiwami 1, a part of me was disappointed that we would likely never see these two again. I mean, today I have no issues with that. I think it makes sense that they don't make more appearances. The reign ended once Seta took control of the Tojo clan, and their arcs pretty much ended after their respective boss battles with the main characters. But man, I certainly did miss them, and for a good reason. They were hella kino.
大河内に立てついたらどないなことになるが、てめえらの体にきっちり刻み込んだる。大河内がなんぼのもんじゃい。俺はウルフ。ウルフだ。
Next, we have Hirose. Now, I can't even begin to express just how much I love this dude. From the start, I was immediately into him. He just seemed like a pretty chill patriarch of his family, not really looking for trouble, doesn't feel the need to intimidate people and show dominance. He's just a chill dude. The voice acting behind him was splendid. I enjoyed the tone and delivery of his lines. Over the course of the game, it became more apparent that he was a lot more aware of the situation than he made it out to be. He knew who Haruto's father was. He was the one who offered hospitality after Haruka left Hiroshima and was apparently buddy-buddies with one of the people involved in the entire conspiracy. And then we saw a twist later on where apparently he was a cold-blooded killer working for Iwami, and he purposely drove Yuta to kill Big Lo. Now, it's easy to make the comparison between him and Kazama, since they're both father figures who were responsible for the murder of the parents of their subordinates, although I would say he draws parallels with Kiryu, Haruka, and pretty much all 4 members of the Hirose family, in a sense that they're all people who lost their parents and eventually got adopted. But while the rest of them received parental figures that on some level cared for them and treated them fairly well, Hirose's father figure was a guy who didn't actually give a shit about him and was only taking advantage of him to do dirty work. But even with that, the fact that he had someone whom he could receive approval from and took him in for the longest time was enough for him to dedicate his entire life and identity to him, until we got to a point where a lot of his commitment was now largely being driven by fear after he saw his Aniki getting shot by Iwami just to prove a point. Further from there, it's somewhat hard to know how exactly Hirose felt about his boss, but he had enough self-awareness to recognize that he was being used and how much of his humanity Iwami had lost at that point. It's also interesting how he was capable of feeling remorseful for the killings of his targets, enough so that he saw those sacrifices as big enough that the failure of their long-running procedure would be on some level disrespectful and wasteful in the name of those people who died. And also the fact that he recruited the children of some of his victims, and while we can't say for certain how exactly he treated him, based on the way we saw him act around them and how highly they speak of him, it's hard to deny he treated them with way more love and respect than Iwami ever did. And his love for them can be seen when he wasn't capable of finishing off Nagumo even after this long commitment to this deal he made with Iwami. His death was, to me, one of the saddest moments in the entire series, just because of how much I felt for everyone, where their bonds felt so strong and drew enough parallels with Kiryu's experience that it felt like this tragic and gut-wrenching chain of events. It's almost hard to explain why I put him so high, since it's not like he was that active in the story and he didn't get that much screen time, but the impact he left was so strong to me, and that's why he's goated. Okay, so now we're getting to the tippity top, although technically we've already gotten a taste of it since it wasn't that long since I talked about number 2, but fuck it, doesn't matter, nothing matters. Let's talk about my boy Akiyama. Now, I don't like it when my explanation for why something is good essentially boils down to, oh, I think it's cool. Because, you know, people are trying to take my opinion seriously and I have to at least try to sound like I have good sophisticated taste. But with Akiyama, I don't know what else to say to you. He's the coolest guy. His sense of fashion is S tier, he's very charismatic, knows when to step into the battlefield when he has to, knows his shit about Yakuza to the point where he'll lecture lower ranked fellas on what attitude to take. And his fighting style is fucking awesome, especially in Yakuza 5. He's a guy who mostly fights with his legs even when you grab your opponents, but of course his best feature is his red heat move, where he kicks the opponent by backflipping and starts kicking him in the air with some martial arts nonsense. He's definitely my favorite to play as among the various new protagonists in Yakuza 4 and 5, given how flashy his moveset is. I'm also fascinated by his gimmick. He's a guy who's willing to loan large sums of money to random people he doesn't even know, with no interest charges, so he's not making back his money, but he still runs that business with people just as long as they pass whatever weird tests he has to offer. Those tests are mainly meant to evaluate their character and whether or not he thinks they're worthy. I do appreciate some of what he demands, which can, for example, be offering help to nursery homes. In fact, he's someone who's very connected to homeless groups because of the fact that he used to be among them many years ago after he got fucked up by the company he was working with back when he was still a successful man with a wife who eventually left him. The fact that he never abandoned those groups and still keeps in touch with them shows how little money consumed him. In fact, the reason why he's so rich right now is because he collected a bunch of money from the streets back when the 10 billions of cash fell from the sky after the explosion in the Millennium Tower in Yakuza 1, which then prompted him to use however much money he had accumulated to invest on schemes that put him in the successful state he is right now. He sees that night as a second chance of life that the city of Kamurocho gave to him when he was in one of the worst states of his life, and that miracle is what drives him to give other people the same second try to 180 their lives. But he still puts them through tests, not just to pick the people he thinks he deserves the most, but also to test his own judgment after he had failed to do so in the past when he married a person who dropped him after he couldn't offer financial benefit. It's almost paradoxical how money can be both destructive and life-saving, quite literally at one point. And I think Akiyama is a person who's experimental and manages his life and money in a way that can address this duality and finds the right spot that he feels is the most fulfilling to his goals, desired prospers, and integrity. I feel like if I was as rich as him, I would want to be the kind of person he is. Maybe not exactly like him, but take inspiration from the way he manages his own money in his own freaky way that allows him to stay true to himself and is willing to give back to others in his own weird way. Also, the guy was a major help in Yakuza 5, aiding Haruka and later Kiryu when they were in the middle of some complicated stuff that didn't even have much to do with him, aside from the fact that he loaned some insane amount of money to Haruka's manager, who eventually got killed. He's a good ally with a good heart whom we can all trust, and that's pretty based. Alright, this video has gone on for longer than I wanted. Let's just wrap this up. Dojima no Ryu, aka Kiryu Kazuma. Now, I have a confession to make. While I do genuinely love Kiryu and I think he's a great character, I would say that for a large percentage, probably even more than it should, I partially like him as a meme character. You need to understand, I spent a long time watching shitposts, funny edits, and ASMR videos about my boy Kiryu-chan. I myself have posted memes about him on Twitter. He's just an easily playful character, and I've gotten to the point where the more humorous aspect of him contributes so much to my fondness for him. But let me defend myself for a bit. I am not to blame here. In fact, this is entirely the writer's fault. They were responsible for writing Kiryu into funny situations in side missions and minigames. This is a guy whom we've seen playing a voice role in a yaoi video game, has been an active blogger for years, had pretty petty competitions with other people to determine who has the best fashion sense, fought ghosts, met a girl who could leap through time, had to counteract a malware that made the office computer play an endless lewd voice, got involved with a bunch of people who had some weird baby fetish or something, the fucking karaoke sections. The writers of the games made him a meme, blame them. But on a serious note, Kiryu is a character who gets better with time. I think that if I were to judge him based on my first stages of experiencing this series, particularly in Yakuza 0, he would probably be lower on the list, assuming he would even make it in the first place, but the situation he's put in greatly adds to his experience. For me personally, the most appealing thing about him is his physical strength. He's empowering because he has faced all threat scales and manages to come out on top. He's unfazed by the pettiest conflicts other people try to force on him, all while remaining idealistic, at least relatively speaking. A lot of the times I'll just have fun listening to his deep, intimidating voice, saying something badass and morally comforting right before he'll curb stomp the opponent. Not associating with any group allows him to live by his own ideals and convictions. He'll put himself out there to do what he thinks is right, and with every game it feels like his status in many Yakuza circles just keeps progressing and progressing. He also manages to have compelling contrasts and ongoing banter between him and the antagonist, at least among the better written ones. It's also cool seeing him standing up even after being driven to the darkest corners, even if later down the line his mercy was dimming, which was usually a result of the people he loved getting pushed around. One of the reasons why Yakuza 6 is my second favorite, because of how it was much more centered on Kiryu, which, not to say that I don't like when other characters are spotlighted as mains, in fact I actually prefer it that way. It's just that with Yakuza 6, while the story is about as interconnected with multiple factions as Yakuza games tend to be, we hadn't seen such a Kiryu focused story in a while, and I think the game really went balls deep in making the journey feeling personal to him, and it felt like he was pushing how much about him he was willing to sacrifice for the sake of the people he loved. He faked his death and distanced himself from Haruka and everyone else, and even intended to kill Tsuneo, a line that, well, I mean, at least everyone in the community assumes he never crosses. I have my own opinions as far as the whole Kiryu doesn't kill people thing, but he's definitely not one to come at someone specifically with the intentions of killing. At this point, he's a massive icon to me when you spend so many hours controlling him and watch him kicking and smashing shit. He's basically become as much as a legend to you as he is in the lore of the games, thanks to his violent, gratuitous adventures with enough depth to his character that it's hard to rival his memorability. So kind of an accidental coincidence that the next person I'll be talking about is Majima. Now this is something I always say to myself, that when consuming media, the most important thing to consider when determining which is the best is what made you have the most fun. And of course, fun is achievable in many ways. I have a lot of fun with Majima. He's the definition of eccentric, described by many as unpredictable, but to us the audience, kind of the perfect goofball. He has the right personality to embody the kinds of crazy, psychotic Yakuza who shines in his skills in battle, but he doesn't take shit very seriously, especially initially. All he wanted was to live a free life. He didn't care all that much when the Shimano family started to fade. He completely distanced himself when he started to notice that the Tojo clan was leaning towards management that he didn't see eye to eye with, which eventually led to him building his family that in the long run actually ended up being pretty successful. While Majima did start off as an anti-hero of the sorts, in the end it was clear he had more of a positive interest in Kiryu than negative, which led to him helping out several times, and ever since Yakuza 3 he's been heavily involved with the Tojo clan, which at first wasn't even something he wanted to do and had to be convinced by Kiryu in order to do it. As the series went on, he became an integral member of the clan, belonging more to the good guys. But even with all of this growth, his personality pretty much remained intact. which is a blessing to me. I want to continue seeing his vocal attitude. It's amusing as it speaks volumes to just how much he has transformed since the 80s. Knowing the kind of person he used to act as in the past really builds so much curiosity and desire to see his mind getting explored, which is why I take interest in watching people from his past being involved in the story.
まあこんなわけや。まあ両目があった頃よりも実際弱くなってしもたのかもしれへんけどな。まあ元が強かったからちょうどええわ。
There's also his combat moveset, which is composed of a lot of over-the-top and flashy moves. He was certainly the most fun in Yakuza 0 when it came to combat, and even in other games, he always seemed to have ridiculous gimmicks that made him distinct from a lot of the opponents. I mean, in Yakuza 5, there's a point where he's literally summoning shadow clones, like, what the fuck? Another noteworthy thing to add is, out of everyone in the series, I think Kiryu and Majima are the most entertaining duo. It's certainly true that Kiwami 1 played a huge role in making me feel that way, thanks to the endless amount of harassment Kiryu had to go through, and Majima seemed to always find creative and amusing ways to not only introduce himself, but also sometimes what challenge he had to offer. I mean, with the extent to which Majima is willing to reach in order to get Kiryu's attention, it just becomes endearing. So yeah, I stand for Majima, and I guess that's all. Anyway, I think it's time to wrap up this however long a 6.5 Microsoft Word page scripted video is, and adios meus amigos. I hope you had a lot of fun, and I'm saving money for Yakuza 7, which has no Western release date announced yet, so yay for me.